So let's move on to explicit evangelism. And I'll just tell you up front kind of the way that I look at this. I am thinking often of the idea of the circle of influence. We have at the center of the circle the things over which we have the most influence, and then as it goes out, we have less and less influence. Okay? I think that your heaviest evangelistic efforts should be in the center of your circle of influence. So that's going to start with your family. It would start with your spouse, and then your kids, your siblings, your parents, and then, out to your extended family, your friends, your coworkers, and then, at the edge, you have people in faraway lands. Somewhere in the middle, you have strangers that live among you, and so on. We should put effort in all places in that circle, but I don't think it would be good for us to focus solely on the outer edges to the detriment of the inside. So all of that is really to say that I think that the home is where the most disciple making happens. It is parents preaching the gospel to their children and living it in front of them every day. And we even see that if one has an unbelieving spouse, the unbelieving spouse can be won over as well. So preach the gospel to your family. Before we move on from that, do you want to comment on what that might look like to evangelize to your own children, those in your own household?
Well, as far as your children go, your immediate household, I would say, they see how you live. They know what you really are. They know what's important to you. So the number one thing there to me, especially with kids, is actually aligning what you say with what you do, which is what we're preaching here on the podcast and throughout the ministry. And, that goes for everybody, but it's most important at home because those people really see who you are. They know who you are. They know whether you're praying over important decisions. They know how you're treating one another. They know when you get angry and fly off the handle and what that looks like. So it's most important there that we have alignment with what we do. We can fake some other people out. We can't fake those people out. Now, once you get beyond that, I think there's where a lot of awkwardness comes in with our family members, and I think it highlights the greater issue is that we're not having the right kind of conversations with those family members and beyond that with people in general. And I think having the right kind of conversations is what opens the door to share the gospel. Most of our conversations, and we only go back to when we first kind of relaunched the ministry. This was our focus coming out of the gate, is having spiritual conversations with people, starting in your own household. Because quite honestly, we don't oftentimes have a lot of deep conversations, even with our spouse. Mm-hmm. We tend to live in the same household and go through the motions, but we don't always know what our spouse is feeling, what their greatest struggles are, the things that cause them fear. These are the conversations that we need to have inside our household and then extend to our brothers, our cousins, our aunts, our uncles, those kind of people. But just simply asking the right question and going deeper. Talking about sports is never going to open the door to share the gospel. I ain't going to say never, but it's not the main pathway. The weather, how the grandkids are doing. There's so many surfacey things that we can talk about. There's nothing wrong with talking about them. But if we want to get to the heart of the gospel, the heart of the person, we've got to go deeper with that. And, the great thing is, if you study, this is not just my view on it from a theological standpoint or what, the seminaries are teaching. If you go to any secular university or just read secular books on the subject of how to have conversations with people, how to get to know people, the way to do it is to ask deeper questions. And we're scared to ask people those questions for fear of getting in their space, or even more so scared because we're afraid that if we ask them a question, they're going to ask us a question.
Yeah.
But that's what creates deep connections with people, is having those types of conversations. How is this situation making you feel right now? What are you really scared of in this? What are your aspirations in life? When we start talking about those things, it opens up the door to be able to share things that are meaningful to us on a spiritual level. And so I think that's where people go wrong with family is, let's get past the politics. Let's get past our differences. Let's try to find the common ground, because here's what I have found. When you have those kind of conversations with people, we all are the same. It doesn't matter how secular somebody is or how religious they are. They have got the same fears as a general rule. It's common to humanity. There's a lot of things that we share, and if we find those commonalities and we join together on those things, then it just opens the door to address how we can, or to allow us to talk about how we address those fears and concerns through the gospel.
Yes, and getting to the more marginal relationships in just a moment, creating an environment in which spiritual conversations are common in the household, I think is such a huge part of discipling your children, because all of us have deep questions. We all wrestle, right? And if kids don't feel at liberty to bring those questions up with you, then they will never develop and become mature in their thinking about spiritual things, which will make them susceptible to the deceit of the devil that is rife throughout the world. You need to create an environment in which your kid feels safe to come and say, Mom and Dad, why does God send people to hell? Or why did Jesus have to die for God to forgive us? Or, why is God condemning gay people? Anything like that. That is very important, so that those are all opportunities for you to disciple them and teach them how to work through those things. Now,
well, let me interject right there. A lot of people don't do that. Why? Because if your child comes and says, why is God sending gay people to hell? Or why did Jesus have to die? A lot of times that is why parents don't do it. They're scared of getting those questions and not having the answer.
Yes.
Right. They don't want the answer to be, I do not know. I don't fully understand that.
Yes.
And there's nothing wrong when a child asks a question, or a spouse or a friend or anybody else, to say, that is a very good question, and I don't have a ready answer for you. Let's study it out together. Let's do some research. And then, really got some common ground, because you're working together to get to the answer. But that's why a lot of people don't have these kind of conversations. They're afraid they're going to be backed into a corner. But I don't know, and let's work it out together, or let's try to find the answer, is a valid response to those things. You're being honest. Having really deep conversations with people requires being honest. It requires dropping the facades of I am the perfect Christian and have the Bible memorized from Genesis to Revelation.
Yes. I understand all mysteries.
Yeah, exactly. Let's drop those facades and let's talk about the things we do know, and let's try to move beyond. I think this is very important. Let's move beyond opinions. Well, I think this about God, or it seems to me like God ought to be like this. None of that really holds water. It's, what does the Scripture say about God? And let's look at that together, and let's try to find common ground there, because it is in the Scripture that God has revealed Himself to us. We want to know about God? Go to the Scripture. Do not rely on your opinions.
You give a man a fish, he eats for a day. You teach a man to fish, he eats for a lifetime. When your kid comes and asks you a question, when you give them the answer, you're giving them the answer, and maybe that's beneficial. But when you say, I don't know, let's figure it out together, then you're teaching them how to find answers to questions.
Right.
And they're going to need that at some point in their life.
Well, and what we're talking about here, what I've said about why parents sometimes don't have those spiritual conversations, this fear of not knowing the answer, starts to hit at the root of why we don't do personal evangelism, period. And I think the number one reason is fear. Now, that fear can be based in a few different things. One is lack of knowledge, just like what we just talked about. I think when it comes to, well, maybe even inside the family, but there's a fear of being ostracized. We have this great need to fit in, to be a part of what's going on. And we have a fear that if we say something about the gospel or preach the gospel or talk about sin or forgiveness, that we're going to be ostracized and we're not going to be part of that group. I think just what makes up the social fabric that we live in general, if we can talk about that for just a second, if you and I are having a conversation, I'm looking to you for feedback about what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. And, if I say something that's goofy or that's offensive or whatever, I get a negative reaction from you. And then that guides what I say in the future, or it causes me to alter what I'm saying. Society, the social fabric of life puts restraints on us, which is a good thing. It's how we all live together. But I think it's those constraints that are actually limiting us in sharing the gospel. So the good things of social restraint become a hindrance in sharing the gospel. I think the thing is that what the social fabric really needs, and in part what we're lacking in the social fabric, is right now our social fabric is way too surfacey. Mm-hmm. And people are yearning to go deeper. Mm-hmm. But we've let the social fabric become so shallow that we don't have those deep conversations with people. And if we would actually start having those, I think it would strengthen the bonds of society. It would help us to find common ground. And in doing that, it would actually open up opportunities to share the gospel. Mm-hmm. It would remove the fear of being ostracized, because we understand that, we're going to have some differences, but we're going to connect on a deeper level here. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. It reminds me of something that John Piper says about personal evangelism, which is that a lot of the conversations just in our day-to-day life are simply not serious enough to provide an inroad to the gospel. And what he suggests is that when you want to tell the gospel to someone, what you might need to do is just say, hey, can we go get coffee or get lunch, and do it on the pretense of, let's talk about life. I want to know your story. I want to know what you believe. I want to tell you my story. I want to tell you what I believe. And you set the stage for a more serious conversation rather than trying to make an awkward transition from, the movie I saw last night to your eternal destiny,
Hey, we'll jump off that cliff. That's right. That's a big transition.
Right. So, and the thing is, it's going to require some directness like that. And I think what a lot of people try to do, and, God bless them, I think their intentions are good, is they try to steer the conversation. You're having a normal conversation, and maybe you ask a question that you're kind of hoping will lead somewhere, and doing all this sort of thing. That violates my notions of honest dialogue, I believe.
It becomes manipulative.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. It's manipulative. If you're trying to share the gospel with somebody, I think that the Lord is more honored by you saying, can I share the gospel with you? Or I really want to tell you this. I think this is the best news in the world, and I think you need to hear it. That requires more courage, more boldness, but I think that ultimately it will be more fruitful, because people, they deal better when you're with you when you're just upfront with them, even if what you're talking about is a little bit uncomfortable, right? When people are in an uncomfortable situation, clarity gives peace and calm. It's like, okay, you want to talk to me about this. This is a little weird, but at least I know your intentions, right? It reduces the amount of chaos in the social interaction. Now, to your point about the social fabric, I think that the two fundamental fears of human beings, if I have this correct from a psychological perspective, are death and social ostracization. So this preaching the gospel and taking that bold move and saying, hey, we need to talk about this, that cuts directly to the heart of your deepest fears as a human, which makes it the perfect ground on which to deny the flesh. I mean, when you are acting in spite of that super primal, fundamental fear, you are absolutely mortifying the flesh. And let me tell you, as someone who has tried to do it and has done it, you feel it in your flesh. Like, you can feel it crying out, and there are all the rationalizations and so on. But we need not be ashamed.